My name is Elena Torres, and for 6 years, I was the backbone of Maddox Creative Partners in Austin. Not that anyone would admit it. On paper, I was Rick Maddox's executive secretary. In reality, I was running half the company while he took credit and collected the checks. Rick Maddox was one of those guys who looked good in a LinkedIn photo: silver hair, expensive suits, the kind of confident smile that said "trust me with your money." What that photo didn't show was the condescending smirk he'd give you when he thought no one was looking, or how his eyes would linger a little too long when you bent over to pick up papers he'd accidentally dropped. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March. We'd just wrapped up a client presentation for Lone Star Electronics, a massive campaign I'd essentially designed from scratch while Rick was off playing golf with his country club buddies. The client loved it, loved the demographic research I'd compiled, the market positioning I'd developed, the creative strategy I'd crafted. As soon as they left, Rick called me into his office. "Elena, that went well," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Good admin support on that one." I felt my jaw clench. Admin support? Rick, I created that entire presentation. The market research, the strategy recommendations, the budget projections, that was all me. He finally looked up, that trademark smirk spreading across his face. "Relax, you're just a secretary. Your job is to keep my coffee hot and my schedule clean, not to play executive. Maybe if you focused more on your actual responsibilities instead of trying to be something you're not, we'd run a tighter ship around here." The dismissal hit like a slap. 6 years of 60-hour weeks, of staying late to fix his mistakes, of covering for his incompetence in client meetings. 6 years of being invisible while he collected accolades for work I'd done. But what really got to me was the way he said it, like I was delusional for thinking my contributions mattered. Like I should be grateful he let me exist in the same building as his greatness. That was mistake number 1. Mistake number 2 came later that week. Rick had been getting increasingly inappropriate, accidentally brushing against me when he leaned over my desk, making comments about how I'd look better in heels and less clothes at the office, cornering me by the coffee machine to ask about my personal life in ways that made my skin crawl. I'd been documenting it all, of course. 6 years working for narcissists teaches you to keep records. But on Friday, Priya Shah from accounting pulled me aside during lunch. Priya was quiet, methodical, the kind of person who noticed when numbers didn't add up. She'd been with the company for 2 years, and in that time, she'd become my closest ally in the office. "Elena," she whispered, glancing around the break room, "we need to talk. Somewhere private." We ended up in my car in the parking garage, with Priya looking nervous as hell. "I've been working on the quarterly reports," she started, "and something's not right. There are payments to consultants I've never heard of, charitable donations to organizations that don't seem to exist, and expense reports that make no sense." She pulled out a folder of printouts. "Look at this, $15,000 to Strategic Solutions LLC for market analysis." I called them. The numbers disconnected. The address is a vacant lot in Houston. My stomach dropped as I flipped through the papers. Consulting fees to shell companies. Business dinners that were actually Rick's personal vacations. Office supply purchases that were suspiciously close to the cost of his home renovations. "Priya, this looks like tax fraud. Massive tax fraud." She was whispering now. "Elena, I'm telling you this because if this blows up, he's going to pin it on someone else. And you have access to everything, his calendar, his files, his email. You're the perfect fall guy." That night, I sat in my apartment staring at Priya's folder. Rick Maddox had spent 6 years treating me like I was disposable, like I was too stupid to understand what was happening right under my nose. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The next Monday, I came into work with a new perspective. Instead of just doing my job, I started paying attention to the patterns. Rick's business trips that never seemed to involve actual business. His expense reports that listed $300 dinners for client meetings on weekends when no clients were in town. The mysterious consultant payments Priya had flagged. As Rick's secretary, I had access to everything: his calendar, his email, his file directories, even his personal credit card statements that got sent to the office. For years, I'd been organizing his chaos without really looking at it. Now I was looking, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Rick wasn't just cutting corners or fudging a few expense reports. He was running a full-scale fraud operation, and he'd been at it for years. It started small, a few inflated invoices here, some personal expenses categorized as business deductions there. But as his confidence grew, so did his schemes. He was creating fake consulting companies and paying them for services that never existed. He was writing off his lake house renovations as client entertaining facilities. He was even claiming his daughter's college tuition as an educational consulting expense. The deeper I dug, the more brazen it became. Rick had a whole network of shell companies with names like Austin Marketing Solutions and Texas Strategic Consulting that existed only on paper. Money would flow from Maddox Creative Partners to these fake companies, then get funneled into Rick's personal accounts or used to pay for his lifestyle. I found receipts for a $40,000 kitchen renovation labeled as office equipment upgrades. Vacation photos from Cabo with invoices claiming it was a client development retreat. Even his wife's plastic surgery was hidden in there as a professional development seminar. But the real smoking gun was in a folder buried deep in his computer directory, labeled archive_LD. Inside were years of doctored tax returns, falsified financial statements, and records of payments to offshore accounts I'd never heard of. Rick Maddox wasn't just stealing from the IRS. He was stealing from his own company, inflating expenses and hiding profits to minimize tax liability while living like a king on money that should have been going to legitimate business expenses, like employee salaries and benefits. Including mine. For 6 years, Rick had been crying poverty when it came to raises or bonuses, claiming the company was operating on thin margins. Meanwhile, he was siphoning off hundreds of thousands of dollars for his personal use and laughing all the way to his offshore bank accounts. The breaking point came 3 weeks into my investigation. Rick called an all-hands meeting to announce that there would be no bonuses this year due to challenging market conditions. As he delivered this news, I could see the Rolex he'd bought himself the previous week, the one I'd seen the receipt for, labeled as a client gift on his expense report. After the meeting, as people filed out looking disappointed and stressed about their finances, Rick caught my arm. "Elena, I need you to stay behind. We need to discuss your performance." My heart started racing, but I kept my expression neutral. "Of course, Rick." Once the conference room cleared, he moved closer than necessary. "You know, Elena, I've been thinking about our little chat a few weeks ago. Maybe I was a bit harsh." He was standing too close, that familiar predatory gleam in his eyes. "A smart woman like you, with your assets, you could go far in this company. But you need to be loyal. Discretion is so important in business." His hand brushed against my waist, and everything clicked into place. This wasn't just about the fraud. Rick was worried I was getting too close to something, and he was trying to buy my silence with a promise of advancement and thinly veiled sexual suggestions. "I understand completely, Rick," I said, stepping back with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Discretion is everything." He relaxed, thinking he'd handled the situation. "Good girl. I knew you were smart." That phrase, "good girl," like I was his pet dog who just learned to sit on command. It echoed in my head as I walked back to my desk, past co-workers who were probably wondering how they'd make rent without their expected bonuses, while Rick prepared to write off another personal vacation as a business expense. That night, I made my decision. Rick Maddox had built his empire on fraud, theft, and the assumption that people like me were too stupid or too scared to do anything about it. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Building a case against someone like Rick required patience and strategy. I couldn't just march into the IRS office with a stack of suspicious receipts. I needed ironclad evidence that would stand up to scrutiny and lead to real consequences. Fortunately, Rick had made one crucial mistake. He trusted me completely. In his mind, I was just a secretary, too simple to understand the complex financial maneuvers he was pulling. This blind spot became my biggest advantage. I started by creating a systematic record of every fraudulent transaction I could find. But I was smart about it. Instead of printing documents or downloading files to external drives, I used Rick's own system against him. Every search I conducted, every file I accessed, every document I reviewed was logged under his administrative credentials. You see, Rick had given me access to his accounts years ago so I could manage his calendar and correspondence. What he didn't realize was that this access included his financial directories, tax preparation software, and even his personal banking portals that he'd logged into from his work computer. I spent my lunch hours in the office, methodically documenting years of fraud. I created spreadsheets tracking the fake consultant payments, cross-referenced expense reports with actual receipts, and built a timeline of how the money flowed from company accounts to Rick's personal finances. The beauty of it was that every piece of evidence I compiled was technically discovered through Rick's own access credentials. From a legal standpoint, he had compiled this evidence himself. Priya became my silent partner in this operation. Her accounting background helped me understand the technical aspects of the fraud, while her access to the company's financial systems let her verify my findings independently. "Elena, this is bigger than we thought," she whispered during one of our parking garage meetings. "He's been underreporting company income for years. The IRS is probably missing out on millions in tax revenue. But we needed more than just financial records. We needed to establish intent, proof that Rick knew exactly what he was doing and had planned to deceive the IRS. That's when I found his email correspondence with his personal accountant, a guy named Marcus Webb who worked out of a strip mall office in Round Rock. The emails were damning, discussions about creative categorization of expenses, strategies for maximizing deductions, and explicit instructions to make sure this doesn't look suspicious. In one particularly incriminating exchange from the previous year, Rick had written, "Marcus, I need you to work your magic on these receipts. The lake house renovation needs to disappear into office improvements, and that Cabo trip needs to become a client conference. You know the drill." Marcus had responded, "Rick, we're pushing the envelope pretty hard here. If the IRS audits..." Rick's reply, "The IRS audits poor people and small businesses. They don't have the resources to go after successful entrepreneurs like me. Besides, Elena handles all my paperwork and she's too dumb to know what any of this means. We're bulletproof." Reading that email felt like being punched in the stomach. Not only was Rick stealing from the government, but he was laughing about it, secure in his belief that I was too stupid to understand what he was doing. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source, Rick's own arrogance. During a client meeting in late May, Rick was bragging to a potential client about his tax optimization strategies. I was taking notes in the corner, invisible as always, when he said something that made my blood run cold. "The key to building wealth isn't making more money," he told the client with a conspiratorial wink. "It's keeping more of what you make. My accountant has helped me reduce my effective tax rate to practically nothing. The government doesn't deserve half my earnings just because I'm successful." He went on to describe, in general terms, some of the techniques he was using, techniques that matched exactly with the fraud I'd been documenting. He was so confident in his superiority that he was essentially confessing to tax evasion in front of a witness. I made sure to get every word of that conversation in my notes. By June, I had compiled a comprehensive file of Rick's fraudulent activities spanning 5 years. Fake consulting payments totaling over $800,000. Personal expenses disguised as business deductions worth hundreds of thousands more. Underreported income that had cheated the IRS out of an estimated $2.3 million in taxes. But I still needed to be careful about how I exposed him. Going to the authorities directly would raise questions about how I'd obtained the information, and Rick's lawyers would probably try to claim I'd violated privacy laws or stolen proprietary information. I needed a way to make it look like Rick's fraud had been discovered through normal business operations, not through a deliberate investigation by his stupid secretary. That's when inspiration struck. The company was due for its annual financial review, conducted by an outside auditing firm. As part of the review process, I was responsible for preparing documentation packets for the auditors. It would be perfectly normal for discrepancies to be discovered during this process. I began subtly introducing inconsistencies into the financial reports I prepared, not fabricating anything, but highlighting existing discrepancies that Rick had tried to bury. An expense report that didn't match the supporting receipts. A consulting payment that couldn't be traced to any actual work product. Charitable donations to organizations that seemed to exist only on paper. These weren't smoking guns by themselves, but they were red flags that would prompt questions. And once auditors started asking questions, Rick's house of cards would start tumbling down. The trap was set. Now I just needed to wait for Rick to spring it himself. The moment I'd been waiting for came on a sweltering Thursday in July. Rick was in one of his moods, the kind where he felt the need to remind everyone in the office exactly how important he was and how replaceable they were. We were in the middle of preparing a proposal for a major client, Southwest Energy Solutions. It was a $500,000 account that could make or break our quarter. I'd spent weeks researching their industry, analyzing their competition, and crafting a strategic approach that would position us perfectly for the win. During the team meeting to review the proposal, I was presenting the market analysis I'd developed when Rick cut me off mid-sentence. "Elena, stop." His voice was sharp, dismissive. "This is supposed to be a professional presentation, not a high school book report." The room went quiet. I felt every pair of eyes on me, watching to see how I'd react. "I'm sorry, Rick, but I think the market analysis is actually quite..." "Don't." He held up a hand like he was stopping traffic. "Just don't. Your job is to schedule my calls and fetch the coffee. Maybe if you focused on your actual responsibilities instead of trying to play executive, we wouldn't be running around at the last minute trying to fix your amateur mistakes." The humiliation was complete. After 6 years of doing his job for him, Rick had just publicly reduced me to a coffee-fetching secretary in front of the entire team. I could see the discomfort on my co-workers' faces, the mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them in the hot seat. But what Rick didn't see was the flash of satisfaction that I quickly suppressed. He'd just given me the final push I needed. "You're absolutely right, Rick," I said calmly. "I should focus on my actual responsibilities." That afternoon, while Rick was out playing golf with his buddies, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division in Austin. I spoke to a special agent named Frank Donovan, explaining that I had concerns about potential tax fraud at my company. I was careful to frame it as suspicious activity I'd noticed during routine administrative duties, not as the result of a deliberate investigation. The second call was to my lawyer, a sharp woman named Sarah Martinez who specialized in whistleblower protection cases. I wanted to make sure I was protected legally before this thing exploded. Agent Donovan was professional but skeptical during our initial conversation. We get a lot of calls from disgruntled employees making accusations against their bosses. What makes you think this is a legitimate case of tax fraud?" "I have documentation," I said simply. "Financial records, email correspondence, expense reports. 5 years of systematic tax evasion totaling over $2 million in unpaid taxes." There was a pause. "I'm going to need you to come in and make a formal statement." The next morning, I sat in a sterile conference room at the IRS field office, walking Agent Donovan through the evidence I'd compiled. I'd organized everything meticulously, spreadsheets showing the flow of money from company accounts to Rick's personal finances, copies of falsified expense reports, email exchanges discussing tax avoidance strategies. Agent Donovan was quiet for a long time after I finished my presentation. Finally, he looked up from the documents. "Ms. Torres, this is substantial. If these allegations are accurate, we're looking at multiple felony counts of tax evasion, fraud, and money laundering." "What happens next?" I asked. "We investigate. Quietly. We'll need to verify your documentation independently, conduct our own analysis of the financial records, and build a case that will stand up in court. This could take months." As I drove back to the office, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The wheels were in motion now. There was no going back. Over the next few weeks, life at Maddox Creative Partners continued as normal on the surface. Rick was his usual arrogant self, taking credit for work he didn't do and treating employees like expendable resources. But I noticed small signs that something was happening behind the scenes. Phone calls that Rick took privately in his office. Conversations with his accountant that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. A new nervousness in his demeanor that he tried to hide behind his usual bluster. The break came on a Tuesday morning in September. I was at my desk, processing invoices, when 2 men in dark suits walked into the reception area. They had the unmistakable look of federal agents, polished, professional, and completely humorless. "We're looking for Richard Maddox," one of them said to our receptionist. "We're with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division." I felt my heart start racing, but I kept my expression neutral as I watched them disappear into Rick's office. Through his glass walls, I could see Rick's face go pale as they showed him their badges. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When the agents finally left, Rick emerged from his office looking like he'd aged 10 years. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a barely contained panic that he tried to hide behind forced casualness. "Just some routine questions about our tax filings," he announced to the office. "Nothing to worry about." But I could see the fear in his eyes. Rick Maddox, who had spent years believing he was untouchable, was finally realizing that his house of cards was about to collapse. That afternoon, he called me into his office. "Elena, I need you to gather all our financial records from the past 5 years. Bank statements, expense reports, consulting contracts, everything. The IRS wants to do a comprehensive review of our filings." Of course, Rick, I said, making notes on my pad. Should I include the records for the subsidiary accounts? The consulting payments to Strategic Solutions and Austin Marketing? For just a moment, his mask slipped completely. I saw raw panic flash across his face before he forced a smile. Yes, everything. And Elena? I need you to be very careful with these documents. Make sure nothing gets lost or misfiled. The threat was clear, but it was also desperate. Rick was hoping I would help him cover up the fraud, probably not realizing that I was the one who had exposed it in the first place. Don't worry, Rick, I said with a smile. I'm very good at keeping track of important documents. The next few months were a masterclass in watching karma work its magic. The IRS investigation moved with bureaucratic precision, slowly but inexorably building a case against Rick that would be impossible to defend. Agent Donovan kept me updated on their progress through my lawyer. They had verified every piece of evidence I'd provided and discovered additional fraud I hadn't even found. Rick's tax evasion was worse than I had imagined. The IRS estimated he owed nearly $3 million in back taxes, penalties, and interest. But Rick seemed to think he could charm his way out of trouble, just like he'd charmed his way through every other problem in his life. He hired an expensive white-collar defense attorney, started making public statements about being targeted by overzealous federal agents, and continued to run the company as if nothing was wrong. His arrogance was breathtaking. Even as federal investigators were combing through his financial records, Rick was still padding expense reports and creating new fake consulting contracts. It was like watching someone pour gasoline on a fire. The beginning of the end came in November. Rick had called an emergency board meeting to discuss the harassment he was facing from the IRS and to rally support from the company's investors. I was taking minutes, invisible in the corner as usual, when Agent Donovan and 2 other federal officers walked into the conference room. Richard Maddox, you're under arrest for tax evasion, money laundering, and fraud. The room erupted. Board members started talking over each other, asking questions that nobody could answer. Rick's lawyer jumped up, demanding to see warrants and making threats about wrongful prosecution. But through it all, Rick was staring directly at me. Not at the agents handcuffing him, not at the board members who were supposed to be supporting him, but at me. This is a setup, he said, his voice rising above the chaos. Someone fed them false information. Someone with access to confidential company files. Agent Donovan was reading him his rights, but Rick kept talking, his eyes locked on mine. Elena, tell them. Tell them this is all a misunderstanding. You know how careful we are with our record keeping. The entire room turned to look at me. Board members, lawyers, federal agents, everyone waiting to see what the Justice Secretary would say. I stood up slowly, closed my notebook, and looked Rick directly in the eyes. I'm sorry, Rick, but I can only tell the truth. And the truth is that you've been systematically defrauding the IRS for years. The silence that followed was deafening. Rick's face went through a progression of emotions: disbelief, rage, and finally, a kind of broken understanding. You, he whispered. You did this. No, Rick, I said calmly. You did this. I just made sure the right people found out about it. As the agents led him away in handcuffs, Rick was screaming about betrayal and conspiracies. But his voice faded as they reached the elevator, leaving behind a conference room full of stunned board members and investors who were just beginning to understand the scope of what had happened. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Rick was charged with 23 felony counts of tax evasion, money laundering, and fraud. His assets were frozen pending the outcome of his trial. The company was placed under federal oversight while investigators determined how much of its success had been built on illegal activities. But for me, the real satisfaction came 2 weeks after Rick's arrest. The new interim CEO, brought in by the board to clean up the mess, called me into her office. Elena, I've been reviewing your personnel file and your contributions to this company. It's clear that you've been significantly undervalued and underpaid. She offered me a substantial raise, a new title as operations director, and a generous settlement to ensure I wouldn't seek legal action against the company for the hostile work environment Rick had created. I accepted graciously, but I'd already made my decision. 3 weeks later, I submitted my resignation and used the settlement money to start my own consulting firm. Rick Maddox was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $3.2 million in restitution to the IRS. His lake house was sold, his assets liquidated, and his reputation destroyed. The man who had once bragged about being bulletproof was now facing the reality of being a convicted felon. I attended his sentencing hearing, sitting in the gallery with other former employees who had been affected by his fraud. When the judge announced his sentence, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because I enjoyed seeing someone suffer, but because justice had finally been served. As Rick was led away to begin his prison term, he caught sight of me in the courtroom. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his expression: respect. Maybe even a grudging admiration for how completely I'd outmaneuvered him. After the hearing, Agent Donovan approached me outside the courthouse. "Ms. Torres, I want you to know that your evidence was crucial to this conviction. Without your documentation and testimony, Rick Maddox would probably still be stealing from American taxpayers." "I just did what anyone should do when they see someone breaking the law," I replied. He smiled. "Not everyone has your courage. Or your patience. The way you built this case, the systematic documentation, the strategic timing, it was textbook investigation work." 6 months later, I was featured in a local business magazine as one of Austin's rising entrepreneurs to watch. The article mentioned my background as an executive secretary who had started her own consulting firm, but it didn't mention Rick or the circumstances that led to my career change. I preferred it that way. These days, I run Elena Torres Strategic Consulting out of a sleek office in downtown Austin. I help small businesses optimize their operations, improve their efficiency, and, most importantly, stay on the right side of tax law. My background gives me unique insights into the warning signs of financial mismanagement and fraud. Priya joined my firm as Chief Financial Officer. She's brilliant with numbers and has an eagle eye for inconsistencies that might indicate problems. Together, we've built a reputation for helping companies clean up their financial practices and avoid the kind of legal troubles that destroyed Rick's empire. Sometimes, former colleagues from Maddox Creative Partners reach out to catch up. They all want to know how I figured out what Rick was doing, how I found the courage to take on someone so powerful. The truth is, it wasn't courage that motivated me, it was principle. For 6 years, I watched Rick steal money that should have gone to schools, roads, and public services. I watched him treat employees like disposable assets while enriching himself through fraud. I watched him abuse his power and assume that people like me were too stupid or too scared to hold him accountable. He was wrong on all counts. Last month, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Rick, writing from federal prison. The letter was brief. "Elena, I underestimated you. That was my biggest mistake. I hope you're successful in whatever you do next. You earned it. ERM." I read it once, then threw it in the trash. Rick Maddox was part of my past now, a chapter closed and filed away. But his letter reminded me of something important: never underestimate the quiet ones. The secretaries, the assistants, the people who keep your office running while you take the credit. We see everything, we remember everything, and sometimes, when pushed too far, we do something about it. These days, when I'm working late in my office, I sometimes think back to that Tuesday morning when Rick called me just a secretary. At the time, it felt like a devastating dismissal of everything I'd contributed to his company. Now I realize it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because just a secretary brought down his entire empire, exposed millions of dollars in tax fraud, and sent him to federal prison. Just a secretary turned his own arrogance and criminal behavior against him in a way that destroyed his life and career. And just a secretary is now running her own successful business, helping other companies avoid the mistakes that cost Rick everything. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting ahead. And sometimes, the people you dismiss as unimportant are the ones who hold all the power. Rick Maddox learned that lesson the hard way. But by the time he figured it out, it was far too late to matter.